To explain Cinquecento Italy, I've broken up my usual slides into three parts. So for this first part, I'm focusing on the ideals, particularly the geometry, the sacred geometry that ruled the art of Leonardo and Raphael, two of our great High Renaissance masters. For the rest of the time, it's really going to focus on Michelangelo, and in part that's my bias. In another part, it is just a fact that Leonardo and Raphael actually die earlier on in the Cinquecento. Raphael quite young in 1520. So to think of High Renaissance, already we've talked about humanism and those ideals of antiquity. That the study of philosophers like Plato, Aristotle has led these artists, these humanists, to view the world in ways that might seem very metaphysical to us. And remember, those views actually pair quite nicely with the Catholicism of the time. I can get my slide to advance there. There we go. So let's place ourselves geographically. Once again, we are focusing on Italy in just a few parts, ignoring that Kingdom of Naples, focusing mainly on Florence, really the birthplace of the Renaissance, and in the Tuscany region, Rome, of course, where the Pope holds court and commissions work from both Raphael and Michelangelo. And we're also going to look at Venice to establish kind of almost a two-part dichotomy of philosophy on art. So what I mean by that, if we think of Leonardo and Raphael, their approach to art is constructive. They build up their pictures, as we'll see, using preparatory drawings. And that really comes from the humanism of their work. Remember, we talked about the toolkit of humanism with perspective and foreshortening, thinking about chiaroscuro and the light source to make things that much more realistic. That is not only the style that is wanted by the people of these powerful courts and republics and the Pope too, it's also a way of reaching the viewer that wasn't really a priority for earlier, more medieval and Gothic artists. The Venetian artists that we'll see, and I'll name them later, they approach it in a way that is much more modern. And the way I'm using that word modern will make more sense, of course, as we move forward through time, through the chapters this term. As always, the subject matter, the themes of Renaissance art, particularly painting, hinge on the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary and saints. Notice I'm not really harping too much on individual saints' names. The Holy Family, of course, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, they are the main characters if you're at all unfamiliar with Christian theology. Here we have an example of Raphael's work and the marriage of the Virgin. This is an example of that same mixture of what is described in scripture, so actually taken from the source material from the Bible, and what is added on to it, a little bit of fan fiction, if you will. The idea that the Catholic Church, when people pose questions about something written in one of the Gospels, for instance, they might actually end up figuring out a whole backstory to answer these questions. So what else happens in the life of the Virgin? If that's your question, you can get things from the Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And according to Catholic dogma, you can also get other ideas like her Immaculate Conception. That is, when she came to being in the womb of her mother, St. Anne. This is one of those examples that really follows Raphael's teacher, Perugino. Sorry about that. I'll get to him in a second. If you remember his work about Christ giving the keys to heaven to St. Peter, establishing the power of the Pope, followed this same structure, almost down to the architecture of the painting. So Raphael here is mimicking his master, and that is a way that artists as apprentices learn, and it's a way that one can establish and continue these norms that patrons begin to expect. We've already seen how there are norms, there are conventions to portraiture, profile or three-quarter views. There are expectations that patrons have of these portraits, and that is set in the contract. It's also, by now, by the 1500s, expected, where to the point that we can point to a portrait and say whether it is Flemish or Italian. And when it does get into the more secular realm with portraiture and also with mythology, remember, we can also think about whether it is a private or public commission, whether it is a religious commission that is by the church or by a private individual. This, we can tell, is not only religious, but this kind of half circle shape, that arched shape, fits rather nicely as a panel in an altarpiece. So this was something that would have been a bit more public and not quite so private, and therefore you don't see any mythology in it. You don't see too much imagination, too much fan fiction, I should say. Aside from the subject matter, formally, structurally, artists like Raphael and Leonardo strive for balance and harmony, and that's balance between opposites, light and dark, left and right, and heaven and earth. So the humanist view of Catholicism would be balanced. The humanist reading of scripture, of dogma. And remember, that's where certain fundamentalists like Savonarola come into confrontation with humanism. And yet you can find examples all over the Vatican, even to this day, of this idea of ideal beauty rooted in the ancient world that predates Christianity, rooted in the sculpture of Rome, rooted in the painting of Greece. And that is through the mimicking, the copying of actual ancient artifacts by these artists as apprentices, as students, and the copying of their masters, as we see here from Raphael, to establish the basis of art as disegno, or drawing or design in Italian. You can see down to the structure, Leonardo's painting of Madonna of the Rocks follows the exact same kind of half-arched panel shape here. And for Leonardo, we can also look to an even more obvious use of chiaroscuro. Remember, that is Italian for light and dark. This is the manner in which an artist will use shading and highlighting, particularly on a body. So on, let's see here, on the, whoops, make sure it lets me do my writing, on the face of the Virgin here. Excuse me, my pen is not cooperating. There we go. We have her right side in light and her left side, particularly the jawline, in shade. And that makes us believe, that helps us kind of cross that uncanny valley of she is a grouping of 2D shapes painted on wood here, but she reads as a fully fledged person, a three-dimensional body. And I say that he goes beyond Mantegna and Masaccio because he really depicts atmosphere. He sets a mood in a way that goes beyond just picking a light source and grouping your people in a realistic way. Of course, this is one of his church commissions, so this is not, if you've read the Da Vinci Code or seen the movie, not necessarily some sort of personal, secretive work on the part of Leonardo. The subject is quite fascinating, though. One of the reasons that it is included in the Da Vinci Code, one of the reasons that it is so enigmatic, is because all those conventions I mentioned, how artists copy each other and set down, this is how we paint the Virgin, this is how we paint this is how we paint that. Leonardo departs from that a little bit. And that is one of the signs of, a master, a genius, kind of branching out on his own. I'm not sure if this phrase is still in the book. I didn't catch it, but that Leonardo doesn't so much paint Madonna, the Virgin Mary, and the Christ child, and St. John the Baptist, his cousin, as children in this work, but man and the intention of his soul. So maybe that'll make more sense when we get to the Mona Lisa as well. But sticking with Madonna here, what I'm trying to get at is that there is the literal subject, that is what is painted on the wood. So we have a female, a mother figure, Mary. We have two infants, and they are Christ here, the baby Jesus, and kneeling with his hands in a prayer gesture, that is John the Baptist. And of course, we also have an accompanying angel. Let's look at it as something more Socratic. I know that I'm not there with you to really ask questions and answer questions, but let's start with some questions. First, Madonna of the Rocks. Why are they there in this landscape? Is this a landscape that looks conducive to, taking the kids out for a picnic? Or does it seem a little dark, a little dismal, a little foreboding? Certainly with the way that Leonardo paints with all of his earth tones, and he does this for Mona Lisa too, his landscapes can be quite dramatic, particularly these moments back here, as you can see some atmospheric perspective peeping through. Then the question becomes, well, why are they there? I mean, is this just a friendly meeting of cousins as babies, where Christ, Jesus, appears to be aware of who he is and what he is, with that two-fingered gesture of blessing in his right hand, blessing his cousin John? Then that might seem a little difficult to read it as just a lovely landscape with Mary and Jesus in it. Two, remember with Renaissance paintings, we're given clues, right? That could be symbols. It could also be gestures and gazes. And one of the best ways to think about it is, one, remember the mirrors. Jan van Eyck's mirror, for example, in the Arnolfini wedding. That is one where we have to focus on those and see what is reflected in it, because that's a focal point. Another focal point would be someone looking out at us, and that is right here, the angel. Mary looks down, very demure. She is kind of the classic Mary by now with her blue mantle. The babies look at each other, so they're not really interacting with us, but the angel kind of glances out toward us with a pointing gesture in the right hand, pointing toward John. So perhaps the focus really is John here. Perhaps the focus is the meeting of these two, and Mary, of course, is just facilitating because they're children. The strangest interpretation is based on some x-rays of this painting, where it appears that the head of Jesus used to be up here. And that would make sense because we have Mary's hand there in a rather awkward position. But without a head there that her hand might be resting on, that position of her hand, those crooked fingers, might appear a little unfriendly, a little less than motherly, less than soft and nurturing. And if Christ's head were there, his little baby throat would be right at that finger. So my professor, when I was at Ohio State, went so far as to say, it's almost as if the angel is drawing their index finger across the throat of Jesus in that kind of classic, threatening, I'm going to hurt you or I'm going to kill you sign that we might see in pop culture on television, as a rather creepy foreshadowing of what will come, the Easter story where Christ is arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. And there are foundations for this in medieval art, where the baby Jesus is shown on maybe one side of the altarpiece, and on the other it'll show the crucifixion, where Christmas may be celebrated in December, but still the idea in the imagery is to remember what's coming up in April, the Easter story too. We can see preparation for this type of composition, a much more friendly, sunnier composition on the left side with this cartoon. And cartoon, even as we use it today, comes from this definition of preparatory drawing. So just imagine Walt Disney taking line drawings such as this one on the left and animating them. That is putting many different drawings in rapid succession in front of us on film. That's all cartoon really means. For us now, it means moving picture, right? The original definition is simply a preparatory drawing. So you could see Leonardo in chalk, in charcoal, setting his chiaroscuro, his light and dark, where there's a similar light source, perhaps a little bit more above than to either left or right. And there's a much more warm, familial, motherly positioning of the people, right? With the babies being held, with John there kind of also standing up and obviously being older, looking at his holy cousin there. With these two things, it's intriguing to think about, well, why did Leonardo make these changes? What was it about this commission where he went a little bit darker, a little bit less family-like, a little bit less warm and fuzzy? Sometimes it's all about what the patron wants, and our job is to really kind of ignore that temptation to think that there's some sort of grand scheme behind it. And this is the masterpiece that the Da Vinci Code uses as really the focal point of that fictional scheme about, something, a lost part of the gospel, a secret that the church has been hiding for centuries. The wonderful thing about the Last Supper here is how it visually tells the viewer how to view it. The terrible thing about the Last Supper is it is fading from that wall in Milan as we speak. Conservation efforts have not been quite as successful because of how Leonardo painted it. So style-wise, he's using the whole humanist toolkit here, particularly linear perspective that is mathematically precise, because he is, as an Italian painter rather than a Flemish painter, is really looking at the geometry of it, influenced by people like Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. And each line, each converging line, those diagonals, help us not only to identify the vanishing point, but the vanishing point is actually right there above Christ's head. So perspective and composition work together here to emphasize that focal point of Jesus in the center on that side of the table. This is the moment scripturally where Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And to visually set apart each disciple as an individual, Leonardo paints, think, man and the intention of his soul. He paints every disciple's individual reaction to that statement, where many disciples are saying, "Not I. It can't be me, teacher." And of course, if you know the story, there's one who knows it's him In fact, he may have already been paid his 30 pieces of silver to do the deed. So there's unity here through the converging lines, the central composition, and yet each pose and individual movement also unifies because they gaze forward and back, talking to each other, gesturing. So we have this wonderful back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, all across that table. And that is why everybody's all on that one side. If he painted it the way Masaccio painted Tribute Money, we would have the disciples' backs to us and we wouldn't necessarily see their faces and be able to read their reactions and their personalities. With all of them on one side, sure, it's unrealistic, but it helps us view the painting the way Leonardo intended. So all of this is carefully studied. The scripture has been carefully studied. The human body and gesture and facial expressions have been carefully studied by this master. What is a bit more experimental is the paint and how he put it on the wall. True fresco, buon fresco, remember, is painting or pigment in wet lime plaster. Leonardo used oil and tempera paints, which have their own non-plaster binder, on top of a dry plaster wall, essentially fresco secco. So instead of the paint, the pigment becoming literally part of the wall, it sits on top of the wall. And that's why these lovely colors here are chipping and fading away. Tempera especially is prone to chipping. So Leonardo's love of experimentation with pigment and binder is really where this painting goes wrong, really where this beautiful depth that we see, the halo of light around Jesus's head, the parts of the wall that just kind of guide us slowly in, the way that monks in the refectory at the monastery at Milan would see as they themselves sit down to eat, a reminder of really why their religion exists, a reminder of the central figure in their faith. 200, 300, 400 years from now, it might only exist digitally. Now, I'm certainly not going to have you identify each and every disciple, but for those of you familiar with the story, where's Judas? If you want, you can pause right now and pick which one. Who seems to have maybe a secondary emphasis? Of course, Jesus is number one, right? He's the main focus. Who's number two, focus-wise? Where does your eye go next? So many choices. There's 12, 6 on each side. Who could it be? If you're guessing this one, you read the Da Vinci Code? Nope, that's St. John, the youngest of the disciples, so he looks a little more boyish. This is the culprit. There's Judas here. Now, I've read sometimes it's, he's the only one reaching out onto the table, but we have other contact with the table. It's, his face in shadow. He doesn't have as much highlight on him. He's definitely treated in chiaroscuro terms differently than all the other disciples are. And again, that's becoming more and more difficult to read and discern as the painting fades. But right here we have essentially the beginning and the end of this episode of the story, where Jesus is aware that someone will betray him, and Leonardo goes ahead and gives us that name, that person, as all the other disciples ask, who? And is it me? It's not I. Remember, we've seen The Last Supper before by Dirk Boots. We can see hopefully the change in perspective, a Flemish perspective, which is much more kind of holistically done, based on the boundaries of the panel and not based on geometry as closely as Leonardo's is. We can also see the difference that having everybody around the table makes. Realistic? Yes. Quite as diagrammatic and useful for telling a story, not so much as how Leonardo does it. And note too, one of the great things about humanist artists taking on biblical subject matter is they make things look Roman, and Roman architecture is actually quite appropriate for the Easter story. There would have been Roman architecture at the time in Jerusalem. So setting-wise, Derek Boots gives it a 1400 Flemish interior. See? Over here we have a very bare, just slightly hinted at Roman or classical style that is believably, if not in Italy, then over in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, where the story really does take place. So hopefully, looking at those two first, Madonna of the Rocks and Last Supper, help us to puzzle out what is the big deal about the Mona Lisa. Among the works of Leonardo, she's the most famous. Arguably, she's the most famous painting ever. Is she the greatest painting? No. Short answer, no. Mona Lisa, which is a contraction of Madonna, so essentially this is Lady Lisa Gherardini, wife of a wealthy Italian businessman. This is therefore this is a private secular commission. She's not a saint, she's not a queen. She ends up in France because Leonardo was for a while court painter to Francis I. His use of sfumato, his own kind of dialed up brand of chiaroscuro, with highlighting and blending to the point that it looks like there's a smoky haze, or fume in Italian, so fumato, sfumato, it would be smoky, hazy. This helps set the atmosphere. It also works well with the idea of atmospheric perspective, where what is closest to us, Madonna Lisa, is sharper, in sharper perspective, sharper focus, and everything in the back, that grand kind of fairy tale landscape we saw in Madonna of the Rocks, fades away into the distance. It is very much a window onto a landscape that would have been much more effective if it existed in its original form. It has been cut, trimmed, where we can see hints of columns on either side. Originally, the composition was Mona Lisa sitting on a loggia, essentially a porch, a portico with grand columns surrounding her. So she was in a much grander composition, kind of bookend framed, in a way not unlike the Birth of Venus, not unlike what other artists have been doing with other subjects in the Quattrocento. So it's been trimmed down, it's been stolen, it's been shot at. It now is back in the Louvre behind bulletproof glass, insured as literally invaluable. But artistically, I mean, it's fun to puzzle out, but we don't have the symbols that Ghirlandaio, if I can pull one up, not from our slide list, but from the previous chapter for us. The artist on the left, Domenico Ghirlandaio, included hints about the person. So this woman is rich. We can tell that by what she's wearing, by her jewels. She's also learned and pious. We can see that by the prayer book and the Latin inscription. He's describing her in a way that's much more biographical. If we go back to that idea, man and the intention of his soul, or in this case, woman and the intention of her soul, Lisa's status, her wealth, her education is not what Leonardo's painting here. Yes, there is something enigmatic about her. Usually it's her smile, right? What is she looking at? What is that little smirk? What kind of emotion is this? Because we're used to so many portraits like the left, being very straight-faced, very, very stark, very austere, and focused on aspects of status that are not on display here. And there's even some people who think this is a low-key self-portrait because she has some masculine features. That's bullshit. I'll go ahead and say that. This is Leonardo painting Lisa Gherardini on wood, plain and simple. It's a nice portrait. It's not his best work. It's not even the most famous work. It is, in a way, a meeting of North and South, of Flanders and Italy. If we look at Roger van der Weyden's Portrait of a Lady on the far left, we see chiaroscuro at work. We see that softening of sfumato where we don't see the sharp outlines that we do on Roger van der Weyden's work. So contours are softened. The gaze is lifted up and out. It is the maturity, the ultimate high Renaissance portrait. Yes, I will say that. I will give it that. There are things, though, that are imperfect, or you could say not paid so much attention to. If we look at Venus, who Botticelli places in a very particular landscape that is very flat, very cartoonish, down to the contours of her body with a heavy outline, but we can see the horizon continuing from left to right on either side of her. For Mona Lisa, the horizon seems to shift. There are different points at which the colors fade at the same extent. So there's a difference in depth that we can read on either side, left or right. Perhaps the full composition with the columns of the loggia would have helped make sense of that. That is lost to history. The simplest and also the most complex work of Leonardo comes from his own notebooks. So he didn't make these drawings like Vitruvian Man for somebody. No pope, no rich man, no Medici commissioned him to draw this. This is an idea of that balance where we can maybe say more about Mona Lisa because it's Leonardo, because it's high Renaissance. These painters had very idealist views of their work. Art prior to this was just another trade. It was another craft. It was another way of working and earning money and being part of the community. With the Renaissance, we seem to have this shift toward art being something a bit more divinely inspired. And even in the ancient world, the only art form that was really seen as divinely inspired was poetry. To be able to compose lyrics, to write songs, basically, was to be blessed by the muses. Influenced by that type of reading, there's no wonder that Leonardo and Raphael would frame the world of painting, the world of disegno, drawing, as finding a balance between religious and humanist, between heaven and earth, between sacred and profane. And what I mean by profane, what Leonardo means by profane, is really the world outside of the sacred. It's the opposite, right? So you think of the church and the mall, right? One is a sacred space, one is a profane space. Not that it's negative. For us, I think the word profanity gives it that negative connotation, but that is more earthly, more worldly, and not quite so holy. The sacred and the profane are sketched out in the Vitruvian Man, you can see there's essentially two men here. There is the Vitruvian Man in a position where he has arms parallel to the ground and feet together, and one where, as if he's doing a jumping jack, he has arms up at an angle and feet spread. This is part of Leonardo's study of anatomy of cadavers. You can bet down to the placement of the navel and the phallus, the groin. So we have lovely attention paid to the muscle tone of each leg, each hand. We have lovely shading on the palms of hands, the heels of hands, especially over here. That's not so much the focus as the center of the body. One Vitruvian Man is inscribed inside a square, and another Vitruvian Man is inscribed inside a circle. So the man in the circle, with his feet and arms stretched out, the center of the circle is his navel, the belly button. That is a symbol of the sacred. The circle is a heavenly shape in Platonic thought. And Leonardo takes this and runs with it. Think of the circle as, the sky, the cosmos. And the belly button, that is where we are nourished, right? In utero. The opposite of that is, of course, man inscribed in the square. So the man with his feet together. The center of the square is the phallus, the penis. So that's why I want to make sure this is not Leonardo saying the penis is bad, all right? It is profane, though. It is not sacred in that it doesn't have the same symbolism here, okay? You can read a lot more into this, and I won't stop you, but to have the square here being used, that is a symbol of earth. It is, a solid foundation. Think building blocks are squares and rectangles, right? It is also a great symbol of something that is man-made, something that is man-driven, that is human-driven. So to have the male body part here as its center is not necessarily, it can be, not necessarily though, a way of reading into this sexually and psychologically. What I would say definitely is that it's a way of centering the mundane, the earthly, on something that is still in use as adults, right? So the sacred is something that we lose. It's only connected to our mother when we're in her womb. But our reproductive organs, the rest of our body is more active and with us for the rest of our lives. So we have a sacred beginning, but then the rest of our lives. So you could also think of it as, creation, life, and the sacredness of it, but also the idea of society and everyday things as part of life as well. Have I done it? Have I distracted you enough from the penis thing? Maybe. Just in case you missed it. A little bit bigger for you. Now, this is what he doodles. This is what Leonardo does. We call it the Vitruvian Man because of a Roman writer named Vitruvius, from whom we get a lot of great information about Roman art and architecture. It would definitely be required reading for a master like Leonardo. So as he reads, this is, what pops into his head. This is him illustrating the writing of Vitruvius. It's also him illustrating his own thoughts that he famously wrote backwards. Another example in your book here, I've switched them. I've put the Vitruvian Man on our slide list because I just can't help it. But see how he's studying birth and the fetus and the womb as kind of that means of the sacred, so much as imposing the shape of the circle on the uterus. If you've taken any anatomy and physiology, you know there's some inaccuracies to that drawing, and I think we can forgive Leonardo because his study would be limited to a cadaver who unfortunately was pregnant at the time of death. That is something that would have been very dicey to study in the very Catholic world of Cinquecento Italy. His other more military, more technological examples, crossbows for the Duke of Milan and his famous flying machines, also still capture our imagination to this day from the master's notebooks. So remember, it is disegno, it is drawing, it is the act of pen or chalk on paper that is really the basis of art. The painting is just the final stage. So Raphael follows this idea of disegno based on his master Perugino. So here, I think there he is. There's the image I thought I had for you earlier. Perugino's Christ giving the keys of heaven to St. Peter. We have here another Platonic shape, the triangle or the pyramid, an example of a very solid structure, one where we have stability. You know, when you build a building, you want the widest part to be the base. You don't want the widest part to be up at the top. That shifts the center of gravity and causes failure. So even an architect would recognize this as stable in composition. And in coloring, like his master, we can see the type of trees, especially the fade of the atmospheric perspective into the background, very much influenced by Perugino. The difference tonally here is because one is a fresco and the other is oil. Okay, so don't judge Perugino too harshly next to his student. We can see here that Raphael kind of becomes, he's one part Perugino, one part Leonardo, because he would be influenced by the even during his life famous Italian artist, as well as his master that he would work to impress and emulate. Color tones, though, going from fresco to oil, get more bold. We have the richness of this blue here on the Virgin's mantle, and that lovely rosy glow in her face, in the cheeks of both St. John and Jesus. Much more family oriented, right? Much more warm and fuzzy than Madonna of the Rocks. If you didn't get before while I was asking that question, why are they there in that dark landscape? Hopefully now it makes much more sense. We have, you know, these beautiful chubby babies, John and Jesus, you know, from left to right, in a place that makes a bit more sense. And Mary's gestures also making a bit more sense to simply just mother and child, with the addition of these very faint halos. Even Madonna, you can see that up here to an angle, there it is. She even has a halo that is thin and just barely there, so that it doesn't break that idea of naturalism, because a halo is a religious symbol and not something that occurs in the natural world. Everything else, though, the kind of lovely lazy back and forth of the path down back behind her into the distance, the way that colors are bolder and sharper up front, everything is much more optically true, the way that Leonardo and Raphael would both observe in the real world. On top of that, this is a great example of Madonna, of Mary, being kind of Europeified. Here she is, a lovely golden-haired Italian lady, and not a young girl from Nazareth, as was the real story told in the Bible. I've chosen for Raphael's masterpiece philosophy, though, the School of Athens, just one side of the papal library that he was commissioned to paint. And remember, I don't need you to focus too much on which pope is which. It's enough to just say this was commissioned by the Pope. So on all sides of the library, we have allegories. That is a work of art whose parts, whose content essentially personifies, stand for the title subject. So this is an allegory of philosophy. You could essentially write out that meaning of what is philosophy. You could define it by pointing to various figures in Raphael's composition. So on the opposite walls, there is an allegory of theology, essentially telling visually what theology is, poetry, and law. And you can imagine those books that are about philosophy would have been near this wall, the books on theology, near the theology allegory, and so on and so forth. This was a card catalog as well, telling people how to find which books in the library. To focus it so that it's not quite so overwhelming, if you've studied philosophy, there's a lot of people involved, particularly Greek names. Raphael chooses the two greats, Plato and Aristotle, both Greek philosophers from the 400s and 300s respectively, BC. He's used that semicircular composition we've seen from so many altarpieces, and yet it's blown up, scaled up to fit into the real life vaulting of the library itself. So we have this kind of uncanny transition from real architecture to illusionistically rendered architecture inside the fresco. A very conscious choice on Raphael's part. And that gives us the sense that we could climb up into the space occupied by Plato and Aristotle the way that other artists like Piero della Francesca, like Raphael himself, would have given us the illusion that we could climb up into a space occupied by the Virgin Mary, by Christ himself. So such a composition, semicircle, requires symmetry. It really wouldn't work if our eyes were focusing down onto the left or right corners, right? So the basilica form, as if these people are all occupying a basilica like St. Peter's, with its grand vaults here in succession, giving us a little hint of the sky beyond and a dome up above here, places us architecturally, places us in an area that is not a real life building, but echoes the grand buildings of the Roman Empire, which would have been filled with references to these great Greek philosophers. The Romans were just as much fans of the Greeks as the Italians were. So this centralizes, focuses us down, just like Leonardo's Last Supper, onto the two great men. The vanishing point is essentially right there between their two heads, if you follow the converging lines. And then we can radiate outward to these great corners that are actually the front, the foreground. This is, I think, one of the first ones we've had where the main action, the main focus is actually in the middle ground and not the foreground, not the thing that is closest to us, with the other exception being Last Supper. I think the book does a great job of kind of telling you about, who's who. Again, you don't need to know everybody, but the main thing are, Plato is here in orange and Aristotle is here in blue. I think Raphael also does us a great service by making Plato read as older. He's the older of the two. The difference also is of their take on philosophy that we'll get into in a moment. And that also helps rule who's on the left and who's on the right. Now, beyond these ancient names, we can read one particular guy down here in the foreground who is meant to be Heraclitus, but that's allegorical, remember. This is believed to be a portrait of none other than Michelangelo, who Raphael would have met or come across by this time. In all of his surly goodness, writing, thinking, contemplating. Over here, tucked in near Euclid, showing off some geometrical, astronomical smarts. Very sneaky is a self-portrait of Raphael himself, and a lovely example of that illusionistic architecture that transitions from real to illusionistic. He's placed Michelangelo on the Plato side and himself on the Aristotle side, which is telling. Because Plato stands in for heaven and Aristotle stands in for earth. So here's the ultimate allegory. Philosophy is Greek, essentially meaning love of wisdom, knowledge. This then becomes an allegory for how does one approach knowledge, learning. Plato points upward. You look to the sky, you look to the ideals, think of his Platonic shapes. Aristotle gestures with his palm stretched out to the ground. You observe the real world, you look at the details. His work becomes the basis for our scientific method today. So Michelangelo is the divinely inspired poet, and Raphael is the scientist. One heavenly, the other earthly. See why profane is not bad, it's simply an opposite. So Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, all of them would read this and understand it as, oh, these are two sides of the same coin. That coin is philosophy. How we approach the world and understand the world. And who he places on which side? Scientists and mathematicians on the side of empirical observation. Writers and other thinkers like Heraclitus on the side of idealism. Not everything Raphael painted was so grandiose in its theme and its scope. What he did for Galatea, and this is from the Villa Farnesina. The Farnese family are a very, very powerful Roman family that has at least 2 popes to boast of by this time. So this is a private place in their villa. Therefore, it is more secular, mythological in theme. Galatea is, depending on the story you read, in this particular story, she is a nymph so beautiful, she is pursued by the terrible Cyclops. She doesn't want to, of course, be his girlfriend as he would like. And so she tries to get away, and she's helped, borne along the way by dolphins and other naiads and sea creatures. This is a very common theme in the world of mythology, a woman being abducted, unfortunately. It happens to Daphne. It happens to many at the hands of Zeus. Classical mythology is rife with these terrible examples of non-consent in our words today. What is lovely, I think, here is kind of the heroic focus on Galatea herself and not Polyphemus, not the monster, down to each Cupid's arrow directing us down to this kind of swirling action figure as she strives to get away. She is definitely much more active and strong and kind of master of her story, master of, you know, what she, who she is, than Botticelli's Venus, kind of just simply standing there to be seen, to be looked at. And that we will come back to definitely as we get back to the 20th century in and beyond in chapters 30 and 31. All of that from Rome and Florence is Disegno, where even the most frivolous mythological painting has underneath its paint, underneath its brushstrokes, a geometric structure to it, like the circle. Giovanni Bellini is our first Venetian master, and his San Zaccaria altarpiece is another great example of that Sacra Conversazione, holy or sacred conversation, where again the picture window is used to place the sacred up in front of the person, the viewer, that would have been able to be inspired by, pray by that image. Bellini communicates to the viewer through, of course, perspective, lighting, and symmetry, but also some symbolism rooted in the Middle Ages, saints' attributes. So which book they are holding, or in the case of poor St. Lucy, a dish with her own eyes, identifies them as which saint. So we have St. Jerome up here, we have Lucy, as I've mentioned. Again, not important for us to remember who's who, but to remember that that is how the viewer would approach it. Each attribute would have told the viewer in Venice at the time in 1505, oh, this is who I'm looking at. This is the particular combination of saints, including San Zaccaria, as you can probably bet. In this combination with the very by now conventionalized Mary and Jesus. If we go back to Piero della Francesca's work for the Duke Montefeltro, we have some very stark similarities. We have the egg up here, and there's an egg shape here. All of that on the central axis, connecting to who Mary is as a holy vessel, as a holy mother. From there, though, you can see how one is much more Cinquecento, that is, one is much more rooted in a solid use of not only perspective, but color to make the lighting look that much more realistic. Because the kind of the brightness, the clinical brightness of Piero's, that's Quattrocento. So there's we can tell, like, oh, this isn't quite so convincing, right, as the one on the right. Also, we have that use, just like Raphael, of real framing architecture echoed in what is painted. So it looks like even this vault continues on and connects to the real thing. Having that in the foreground, as it were, the real life architecture, makes it much more a picture window to walk through, to climb through, than what Piero has presented to us. On top of that, we can see the lighting is less harsh, more golden, and much more softly falling on the saints and the Holy Family. We have less outline and more softness of color without Leonardo's sfumato. So the hallmark of a Venetian high Renaissance painter is they build their work with color, whereas a Roman like Raphael or Leonardo would build their work with line. Compare even further back in style to something a bit more Gothic, we can see how fully fleshed out and massive these bodies have become versus kind of the very flat, almost paper doll-like style of the Middle Ages. So going from left to right, we have a shift in time, a shift in focus from something very medieval and French, as the Gothic style is, to something that is wholly Italian, focused on the Roman Empire and the ancient world of the Mediterranean. Bellini is, of course, an artist who follows the tradition of taking on apprentices, and his most famous student, the most famous of the Venetian artists, painted this. For a while, though, this was even misattributed to Bellini because of the way that students mimic, copy their masters. So I'll give you the other clue to allegory. Remember, something's up with the meaning. If there's a mirror, if someone is looking out at us, pointing and gesturing, and also if there appears to be a bunch of naked people and you don't quite know why. I'm serious. What are these ladies doing? We have two musicians. There's a lute in the center, right here. We have a shepherd in the distance, a villa in the background. So we have a very standard foreground, middle ground, background, three-part composition. And it has this lovely diagonal here that keeps it from being too boring. You follow kind of the lines of foreground, middle ground, and background. So it's this lovely central landscape composition that guides our eye in, except for those naked ladies. One appears to be a flute player playing along, but if you're playing flute with two fully clothed minstrels, you'd probably be clothed too, no? One lady at a well with a pitcher of water. The typical solution to this is, one, they're not really there. Two, they're not even really human, probably. Again, classical mythology. Titian, like any other good humanist artist, is, awash in it. If we think of it not in its centrally balanced naturalistic form, but of its asymmetrically balanced, nude, allegorical form that is focusing on her particularly. We shift to the left, away from the center. The center is a distraction. Then it can begin to make sense. Women with instruments around artists, think the classical muses. The idea of divine inspiration, too, is often described using the metaphor of the well of inspiration. And there she is, pouring or dipping into a source of artistic merit, a source of poetry, art itself. So like Mona Lisa, this woman in particular is the focus of the story. And unlike Mona Lisa, she's not someone we can name, not Elisa Gherardini, she's not a Virgin Mary, she's not even a Venus. She is a personification of inspiration. So they sit and occupy the space around these minstrels who are singing, composing, as if they are helping those two humans to do so. So Titian's Pastoral Symphony, named like a song. A pastoral is a song that evokes, think pasture, a rural, classical landscape occupied by shepherds and sheep and not a care in the world, an Arcadia, a paradise. And that's what we have surrounding the muses and the musicians. Go back to it one more time. One of my favorite things to do is to play a little bit music along with it, because in a way, we're looking at this painting is meant to be seen, and yet it is begging really to be heard. So let me play a little bit of lute music for you. Once this ad goes away. There we go. 2 ads. There we go. So ask yourself, does the color match the mood of the music? What type of song do you think Titian may have been listening to as he painted? Maybe not quite this one. This one has a bit more horn flute. But you get the idea. So remember what to look out for. Now Titian, like any other artist, he is getting church commissions, private commissions, like Isabella d'Este, great artistic patron herself to rival any pope, any Medici. And you can see how his work, it's said that he started with, red, for example, like the red in his Assumption of the Virgin, and would just keep on painting, piling on that red pigment. A visitor to his studio is said to have reported, until it was red enough. So he goes by color, the way that Raphael and Leonardo here in Madonna of the Rocks in the center go by design and structure and line. Apply that to a portrait like Isabella d'Este, and we have something that is much more Mona Lisa, where we don't have heavy outline. We also don't have that enigmatic landscape either, do we? That golden light, though, that is definitely Bellini's influence. So color, or colorito, is a focus for a Venetian artist. Color helps set atmosphere. It also helps define textures. And it can work with line. I'm not saying that Titian and Bellini don't give their painting structure. It's just not the number one focus. If they were writing their own treatise on painting, they would put color ahead of line. And Leonardo would do the opposite. And this is especially true because the Venetians are using oil paints influenced by the Flemish artists of the Quattrocento. There's this glowing quality to the Venus of Urbino here. And so Titian becomes known not only for the use of color, but for this very voluptuous body type. And this is also a great example of what becomes a staple in Western art, the reclining female nude. This is a Venus that is very different from Botticelli. And if we go by some of the art history of this piece, this may actually even be a portrait of a courtesan, of maybe the Duke's own mistress. So to call her Venus is perhaps even a misnomer, but we can see some of the idea of portraiture, where she's looking out at us, she's engaging with us, not unlike how Mona Lisa did. So Titian, you can see, is probably very well aware of Leonardo and Sfumato. He's also learned about these great color combinations, the red and green, especially from Bellini. So we have golden light and echoes of red that direct us from foreground to background, and this lovely rich green curtain that acts as the separation between the two. So whether you see this as portrait of courtesan or mythological subject matter in a very Cinquecento Italian setting, we can appreciate this for its color-driven structure. The serving girls back here, reaching into those cases, that's how a typical woman in 1538 would store her clothes, her dresses. They'd be packed, folded very carefully into cassone, cases along the wall. So here they are with one dress already thrown over a shoulder, getting ready to dress this Venus. And she is lounging with her flowers and her lovely little dog here. We've gone from showing pious, learned lady to even more private subject matter here, if it is a portrait. And if we read it as Venus, this is something that we should be familiar with. This is the goddess attended by her serving girls, her nymphs, like Pomona, who even in Botticelli's version has a dress, has clothes to robe her mistress in. So here's the great thing about what the color does. These reds and greens, that complementary color combo, they are not always right next to each other, because when they're next to each other, they can be a little jarring, a little too Christmassy. But with enough distance, they can provide a lovely backdrop for the white of the sheets to pop. And so we have echoes of red, echoes of green, echoes of white. The color is what we use, not any converging line of perspective, even though Titian uses that in the tiles of the floor that we see. Even though we have the use of foreshortening in the legs of the kneeling servant, it's not what really guides our viewing, our reading of the painting. It's the color that does it. So here's against Botticelli, an artist in the Quattrocento who definitely uses more contour line to make sense of his work, so that we see a transition from landscape to air and atmosphere to the body of Venus, which is very much pale and stony, like a stone sculpture that Botticelli may very well have been looking at as a model. On the right-hand side, the skin glows, each contour line that would be very sharp in a Botticelli is hazy and smoky, thanks to Leonardo's influence. We can even see in it that standard golden-haired lady that Raphael used for Madonna. Because at the time, remember I told you about the forehead style? Italian ladies cherished light golden hair. It was something that set them apart from a population that had a lot of very dark hair. Light skin too was praiseworthy, because so many people in the Italian population had that darker olive skin that is very prevalent genetically in the Mediterranean. If they weren't born with it, they would try to use chemicals to lighten both skin and hair. So this is, in both instances, a very Italian take on a very ancient figure, Venus, the goddess of love. So I'll end here and continue on with Michelangelo and then on to Mannerism, hopefully to make sense of what is going on, not only in our discussion of Disegno versus Colorito, but to establish a line between High Renaissance and the rest of the Cinquecento. Because this is 1538 is a little late for High Renaissance. Like I said, it's 1520 when we understand the High Renaissance ending. So already Titian is pushing us beyond the boundaries into the realm of mannerism, where everybody has their own personal style. That is the world in which Michelangelo lives and thrives, with his own very personal style. One where you hopefully will begin to recognize, oh, that's a Botticelli because of the contour line, or that's a Raphael because of the structure, or that's a Titian because of the color.